Guys, this is Shelby with the Rogers Public Library. So this week for Full Steam Ahead, we're going to be talking about pulleys, and we're also going to be talking about wheels and axles, and these are both examples of simple machines. But before that, I want to do a little recap of what we talked about last week. We talked about levers, and we talked about mechanical advantage, and how that's related to work, right? So work is a force done over a distance. And when you increase the distance that you're doing that work over, you can reduce the amount of force that you have to do to make things move, right? And that's really nice because that means you don't have to work as hard. You don't have to use as much of your energy to, move things. And that's why levers are useful. And, we talked about levers and how we determine their mechanical advantage, the amount that they reduce the force you have to put in to make things move is relative to the distance between where you're moving the lever and the point that it's rotating at. And that's kind of relevant here, right? Because when we're talking about pulleys, and these are pulleys up here, we have this point of rotation. And so it's a little bit similar to a lever, but there's a couple differences here. The main one is that when we talked about levers, we were talking about something called linear motion, right? That's forces in motion that move in straight lines. But pulleys don't move in straight lines. They move in circles. And when things move in circles, we say that's rotational motion instead of linear motion. And when we have rotational motion, instead of talking about forces, we talk about something called torque, and it's pretty similar. You can think of it like forces, but instead of it being a push or a pull, it's more like a twist, right? And a torque, that's just it's the radius of the circle, or the distance from the point of rotation, times are multiplied by a force going perpendicular to the circle like this, right? I move my hand like this and it makes the circle move, and it's circular, it rotates, right? But that's not the only thing that determines the mechanical advantage of a pulley, right? There's actually a couple other things that do, just besides just the distance from the point of rotation. And one of them is the number of pulleys that you're using, right? So I have this nice system. These are water bottles that I cut up and put attached fishing line to. So you can see that if we have a marble over here, a marble over here, they balance. With two marbles and that side sinks down, right? So there's no mechanical advantage. There's not one force that's being done over a longer distance to make kind of like the lever, right? Where we can have the Lego blocks, we can put a bunch of Lego blocks on one side and one Lego block on the other side and have the one Lego block be heavier. But instead, the mechanical advantage of a pulley is determined by how many you use. So now we see the same number of marbles. Before, this one was sinking down just on its own weight. And now this one seems to be balancing it, even though there's less marbles. There's half as many marbles, right? And that's because we're getting some mechanical advantage by using 3 pulleys instead of just 1. But also here, check this out. When we use 2 pulleys instead of just 1, we get the same thing that happened with the 1 pulley. And we don't with 3. So it's not the mechanical advantage of pulleys isn't actually relative to the absolute number of pulleys you're using, but the number of different segments of rope that are holding up the weight. So right now we have this section of rope that's really tense and this section of ropes that are really tense. So and because of that, there's it only takes half as much force to lift up either side of the basket. So right now, there's an even amount in both sides. And then watch this. You can put another one in. So there's 4 and 3, 5, 6. It's moving a little bit. 7. Right? Let's see what happens when we lift this up. It sinks down, right? So it takes 7 marbles, or slightly over half, to lift up side, right? So it's saying, that's another way of saying that we can balance these. We can balance 6 marbles and 3 marbles because we're using 2 pulleys at once. Or another way we can think of it is that we can counterweight through 6 marbles with 3 marbles and reduce the amount of lifting that we, or the amount of force that we have to put on this by a lot less. And that's what makes pulleys useful. And there's one other thing though, and that's that these also redirect forces, right? So normally if we wanted to move an object upwards, we'd have to push it from below or pull it from above, right? But when we do it this way, we can pull down to make the basket go up, right? So it's redirecting. And that's another thing that's not related to the mechanical advantages of pulleys. That's just something else that pulleys do that make them useful. Yeah. And then these, the last thing about pulleys is these are fixed, right? These pulleys stay in position no matter what. But there are some pulleys that will move when you move the rope, and these they're not fixed. They're called, this is a special type of pulley called a block and tackle. So you have one pulley that stays in place and another one that moves up and down with the rope. And you can get the same type of mechanical advantage with the setup like this that you do with the setup with 3 pulleys when the 3 pulleys are all in place. So, and now we're going to talk about wheels briefly. So you'll notice that when we have this, we have the 3 marbles and the 6 marbles, or the 7 marbles, I guess. So we have this balance. We also have some stuff going on in the back. So there's some rocks in this. I just did that so that when we front load this side with a bunch of marbles, it doesn't get unbalanced and tip over. So that's a safety thing. But and then you also see there's these funky tape things attached to the back of the pulley. This is a crank. So this is a type of lever that's used to rotate a pulley or a gear or something like that. And this is a wheel. So check it out. So we have a pulley on this side. It's a tiny circle. And we have a wheel on this side. It's a big circle. So when we turn this wheel, because the distance between the outside of the wheel and the point of rotation is greater than it is over here, we're actually multiplying our forces, just like we do with the lever. And that's a pretty cool thing. And if this wanted to behave, we could use this wheel to raise up this basket and do it a lot more efficiently than we would just by pulling and pushing. But it doesn't. Instead, it goes this way, but when we turn this way, it just spins by itself and it slips, right? And so this is a source of inefficiency. And what I mean by that is some of the force that we're using to try to move the marbles gets lost. And it specifically gets lost through something called friction. And to talk about this a little bit, we're going to bring in something related to pulleys, but a little more complicated. So this is a bicycle. We happen to have this one at the library. And you'll notice over here we have something that looks a lot like a pulley system, but the difference is that instead of being smooth, there's little teeth or notches, right? And these are called gears, right? So this is a gear and this is a gear, and the thing that connects them is called a chain. It's made out of metal and stuff. So and so it basically does the same thing that a pulley does. It basically does the same thing that a pulley does, but the difference here is that when we have the teeth, it reduces a lot of the energy that we lose as friction, right? There is no slipping. It just turns because it has teeth to grab onto the chain, unlike how the pulleys are, right? They're completely smooth, so they can't grab on. And that means that they're more efficient. And the other benefit of these teeth is that sometimes you can have the teeth meshed together, right? So you can actually have two gears right next to each other. If you look at a clock, that's how they're set up. So that's useful. But in this case, we're using a chain because when you have two gears that are meshed together and you turn this one direction, the other gear goes the other direction, right? So it changes the direction of rotation. But with the belt, that doesn't happen. And that means that when you pedal to go forward, the wheel turns to go forward at the same time. And then the other parts of the bicycle that are related to this idea of simple machines is over here we have the handles. The handles are a type of lever, right? They increase the force that you're putting in to turn the front wheel. These are also levers. The pedals are. They're specifically a form of a crank, right? They're attached to a circle or a pulley, or gear in this case. And this whole assembly with the gear and with the pedals is called a crankset, right? And so when you turn the pedals, you're producing a lot of torque, and that's rotating the gear, and that lets you go. But you'll notice that this gear down here is a lot smaller than this one up here. And so from what we know about the distance from the point of rotation, and what we know about levers and pulleys and all of that, we think maybe it's not a good thing, right? That means you're reducing the force that goes to the rear wheel. But in this case, it's actually helpful because when you reduce the amount of torque that gets to the back wheel, you make the bike go faster. And this is because of something called the conservation of angular momentum. So if you get on a chair and you start spinning around and you have your arms out, then you're going to spin very slowly. But if you bring your arms into your chest, you'll start spinning faster. You can put your arms out and take your arms in and adjust your speed that way. And that's because the rate at which you spin is related to the radius of your circle, or how far you are out from the point of rotation. So we reduce the radius of the circle and we make the bike go faster. And then of course there's also wheels and axles here, right? There's a very small piece rotating in the middle around a bigger piece. And wheels and axles, they're used for more than just like bicycles and cars and stuff like that. You can also use them as a type of winch called a windlass. So that's used for lifting stuff up, kind of like pulleys. And then just as a last note, you'll notice we talked about friction in terms of slippage, or in terms of the pulley slipping. We can also talk about friction in terms of the tire wheels. So they're made out of rubber, and if you used a rubber eraser before, you know that when you rub it against the table, it gets warm, right? Because of friction. And that's actually a good thing in this case, because if the wheels didn't have any friction at all, you would just slide around and you wouldn't be able to control the bike at all. So you want a very grippy material like rubber for your tires to be made out of, so you don't go sliding and get hurt when you crash your bicycle. So this is our craft for this week. So what we have here is we have some spinning tops, and if you'll notice, they look a lot like the wheel and axle that we were messing with earlier, right? That you have the big circle and then you have the tiny circle at the other end, and that you can use that to increase your torque in order to make it easier to do work, right? We don't use tops to do work, but we do. We have fun with them. They're pretty cool. But this week specifically, we're going to be using them to make art. So this one I just made as an example of something that you can do at home with some Legos. But this is the one we're actually using, and it's got a marble at one end, and it's got a glue stick cap at the other end. You can use a marker cap or anything. It's just something that you can get your fingers on so you can spin it. So that's number one, what you need to make this artwork. Number two is a box, right? We're going to be putting paint on the spinning top, and when that happens, it splashes all over the place. So you want a box like this with pretty tall walls to keep the paint contained so you don't get splashes all over the place. And then the last thing that you'll need, of course, is a little bit of paper and a little bit of paint. I think this one's tempera and this one's acrylic. It doesn't really matter, but I've diluted them down with water just so they flow a little bit easier, and you'll see why in a second. So we have our paint. So I just put a sheet of paper at the bottom of this, and we have the top, and we spin it. You wanted to get it going pretty fast, and then you just dribble some paint. And you'll notice it makes a kind of a circular pattern. And the way that the splashes get on the paper depend on the direction that you spin it, if it's clockwise or counterclockwise. It also depends on how fast they're spinning. If it's spinning pretty slow, it's not going to fly as far, and when it's spinning fast, it's going to end up hitting the walls of the side. So you'll get something pretty cool like this. There's a lot of splatters. There's also some parts where the disc has scraped the wheel, and they make some pretty cool shapes as well. We'll set that aside. Now we're on cardboard over there to make sure it doesn't stain anything. Second piece of paper. Great. So if we spin it pretty slow, we'll get some other weird stuff. Theoretically, you can do this with a smaller piece of paper, but you'll notice that when we do splatter the paint on, none of it ends up, we don't ever get any paint underneath the disc, right? So if you have a smaller piece of paper, that really limits the amount of paint that you can splatter at once, if that makes sense, right? Or the disc takes up a lot more of the page with a smaller piece of paper. So this one's going to end up taking a long time to dry because I spilled a lot of paint on it, just on accident. So here we go. Yeah, see, there's some lines where the paint kind of dripped down because I got too much on it. Here's some of the ones that I made earlier. You can see how they look like when they're dry. So this one, I put too much water in the paint, so it's kind of faded out. This one turned out a little bit better. So that's with relatively thick paint, you get a nicer coating. You can also do it with some of the blotches like this, right? This one as well, right? So, yeah, when you do this, I guess the main thing to keep in mind is making sure that your colors kind of go well with each other, right? So I used pink and blue and purple for this, and so they kind of blend in together well. And then for these over here, I used green and red. And just a little kind of festive thing, right? It's December now, and so we're going into Christmas mode. But yeah, that's the craft for this week. I hope you guys like it, and I'll see you next time.